Welcome to today's audio lecture on document design and data visualization. During this lecture, we'll be discussing four broad topics. First, we'll be discussing writing as a visual medium. Second, we'll review the basics of block formatting. Third, we'll talk about some advanced techniques for block formatting. And finally, we'll discuss tips for data visualization. First, let's begin with some basics and talk about why you should think of writing as a fundamentally visual medium. We should think about writing as a visual medium because the appearance of your written work has a tremendous impact on its reception. Well-designed documents that have visual appeal, they invite your readers to engage. Well-designed documents, visually appealing documents, are also easy to scan and to navigate quickly. They help your reader find the information that they want and need at a moment's glance. Effective visuals, meanwhile, by which I mean charts, graphs, and diagrams, are easy to analyze and to recall. They're also great for presenting data efficiently, and they translate really effectively across different cultures. So now that we've discussed why it's so important to craft visually appealing documents that incorporate strong visuals, I want to go back and talk about the basics of block formatting. A lot of this content will likely be familiar to you. It's a rehash of information that I previously presented in the Block Formatting and Business Documents audio lecture. But since we're going to be building on this foundation, I thought it was nevertheless important to review this content. So as you'll likely recall, block formatting is the style of formatting that we use for business documents. It's characterized by 5 main characteristics. First, it features left-aligned text with a ragged right margin. Second, it usually uses single or 1.15x spaced text. Third, it uses full line breaks between paragraphs. Fourth, it typically uses headers and subheaders to signpost content. And finally, it often uses bullets to make information scannable. If you'd like a fuller description of what each of these elements refers to, please go back and review the Block Formatting and Business Documents audio lecture. But in the meantime, here are some quick examples of left-justified text, of text that uses ragged right margins, of headers and subheaders, of single-spaced or 1.15x spaced text, of bulleted lists, and of the white space between paragraphs. And with these design basics in hand, let's move on to a masterclass in block formatting. Let's discuss how you can enhance these design principles to maximize the effectiveness and the visual appeal of your documents. First, let's talk about fonts and how you can choose the right font for different sections of your document. The main thing you need to know is the difference between a sans serif font and a serif font. On the left, we have an example of a sans serif font, in this case Century Gothic, and on the right we have an example of a serif font, in this case Century. The big difference between these two font types is that serif fonts have those little points that I've circled in orange. These points, not surprisingly, are called serifs, and so a serif font is a font that has serifs, and a sans serif font is a font that does not have serifs. That's literally what the phrase sans serif means in French. Now, these little points, these serifs, might seem insignificant at first glance, but they actually help speed reading. They point the reader's eyes along the line of text and expedite the process of reading. Because serifs expedite the process of reading, we want to reserve them for the body sections of longer documents, for portions of a text that we want our reader to be able to navigate quickly. We want to reserve sans serif fonts, on the other hand, for either short text where reading speed is not so critical, or for the headers and titles of lengthier documents where we want our reader to slow down, to pause, and reflect on the meaning of our language. Now let's put this tip into practice in a sample message. So on the screen, you'll see a message that is written entirely in sans serif fonts. And so to enhance readability, we want to take the body sections of this text and render those in a serif font. Now, obviously, this document still has a long way to go before we make it fully visually appealing, but simply by rendering the body of these sections in serif fonts, we've enhanced readability and we've made the document slightly more visually appealing. Next, let's talk about headers. One of the best things that you can do to write strong headers is to avoid short, generic headers. Instead, use longer, more descriptive headers that preview your point. Your header should still be one line in length or shorter, but you can use a lot of real estate on that line to ensure that your headings are longer and more descriptive. With that advice in mind, please cast aside headers like problems or solutions. These are the kinds of short, generic headers that I was referring to in the previous slide. Instead, use longer, more descriptive phrases like guidelines for effective lists, or a fresh approach to our staffing challenge, or PIP membership provides access to data. All of these headers provide a stronger preview, a more descriptive preview of the sections that they sit at the head of. Armed with this tip, let's again return to our sample message. As you can see, this sample message currently has those short, generic headers that we've now been cautioned about. And so to improve this message, let's replace these short, generic headers with longer, more substantial headers. Headers like results of recent AXR Human Resources Survey, or updates to AXR pay and benefits policies. Both of these are stronger and more descriptive than our previous short, generic headers. Next, let's review some tips for writing effective lists. Now, a lot of this content will be familiar to you from the class memo using vertical lists, but given the outsized role of vertical lists in business communication and workplace communication, it's important to review and summarize a lot of this content here. So the basic tips of effective list usage are as follows. First, you want to reserve lists for parallel information, for examples of a given principle or steps in a process. You want to use lists sparingly. You want to keep your list short, typically to 5 or 6 items or fewer, and you want to frame them consistently. You never want to drop a list into a text without introducing it first. Instead, you always want to include a sentence or two telling your reader what the list is about and what the key takeaways should be. Back in our sample document, we've got a section that's just crying out for a vertical list. If you look carefully at that second body section, you'll notice a lot of parallel pieces of information. In this case, the pay and benefits policy changes that AXR is planning on rolling out. And so to render this information more effectively, to help our readers more quickly and easily navigate this information, we're going to reformat it as a vertical list, in this case, a series of bullet points. Next, let's discuss the importance of cohesive formatting. You always want to format your document's design elements so that they look consistent, they look cohesive, they look unified. It's just more visually appealing and it looks more professional. Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed, for instance, that in our sample document, the first and second headers do not use the same font, and the first and second body sections do not use the same font. You also might have noticed that while the first and second headers both use bold text, that the second header is rendered exclusively in capital letters, while the first header is not. So to make our document more cohesive, more visually appealing, we're going to render the first and second headers in the same font using the same formatting style, and we're going to render the first and second body sections in the same font as well. Doesn't that just look better? Next, let's talk about organizing our documents for scanning, putting information in locations on the page or document where we can be confident that our readers will see it and engage with it. To organize our documents for easy scanning, we need to know how readers navigate and scan different types of documents. And thanks to some research using eye tracking technology, we know just that. And what these researchers discovered is that when readers navigate a paper document, their eyes tend to follow an F pattern. They spend a lot of time looking across the page at the top of the page, and then they tend to concentrate on the leftmost margin as their eyes move down the page. In electronic documents, on the other hand, readers' eyes tend to follow a Z pattern. They move across the document at the top of the page, and then they scan downward in a diagonal fashion, and they begin the process again, looking across the page once more before continuing to move down the page in that diagonal fashion. Now, how can we take advantage of this information on reader scanning behavior? To put this information into practice, let's go back to our sample document. Let's imagine that we want to add a graphic, in this case a chart, to our sample document, and let's further imagine that this document is a paper document. By referencing the F pattern that readers use to scan paper documents, we know that the best place to put a chart or graph is in the upper right-hand corner of the document. We can be reasonably confident that our reader is going to pay close attention to that top tier of information, and then their eyes are going to drift down the left margin of the page. Lastly, remember that white space is a critical element of document design. A lot of times when we're putting together a document, we feel this need, this compulsion to make use of every last inch of the document. But ultimately, that just makes our document look cluttered. It makes it look uninviting. By leaving some white space on the page, we make it more visually appealing, we make the document more inviting, and we make it easier to navigate. To demonstrate the impact of white space on document design, take a quick look at this slide, which uses white space minimally, and then take a look at this revised version of the slide, which introduces additional white space. Hopefully you'll agree that the second version, this revised version, is significantly more appealing, it's more inviting, and it's easier to navigate. That's the power of white space in document design. Okay, enough about document design. Now let's turn our attention to data visualization and discuss some tips for how you can create effective charts, tables, and graphs. Here's the first tip. Always make sure that you introduce your graphics with text summaries in the body of your document. No matter how well you construct your data visualization, it likely doesn't speak entirely for itself. It's therefore best practice to make sure that you call out the important points or the key takeaways from the data visualization in the text of your message. Here's an example of the kind of text summary that should accompany and most likely precede your data visualization, right? This summary not only tells readers what to expect from the table below, but it explicitly includes a brief parenthetical that indicates that this text summarizes the table below. The next tip, make sure that you choose the appropriate graphic by matching your graphic type to your purpose. For instance, you should use tables to show exact figures, particularly when you have a large quantity of figures that you want to show. You should use bar charts to compare quantities. You should use line graphs to illustrate change over time. You should use pie charts sparingly, but if you do use them to show how parts of a whole are distributed. And you should use flowcharts to illustrate a process or a procedure. Let's go back to the example from a few slides back and ask ourselves if the graphic type matches our purpose. Now, if you read through the text summary here, you'll notice that what the text summary emphasizes, the key takeaways it emphasizes, are all about change over time. And yet a table is not the graphic that is optimized for illustrating change over time. So in fact, a table is not the appropriate data visualization for this information at all. Instead, we should be using a line graph, which is what we see in this slide here. But simply choosing the appropriate graphic type for our purpose is only one part of the challenge when it comes to optimizing our data visualizations. Once we've chosen the appropriate graphic for our purpose, we then need to go about making sure that our graphic is as strong and as detailed, as informative as possible. And one of the ways that we can do this is by supplying our graphics with titles and labeling all of their elements. Let's go back to that line graph that we unveiled a couple slides back. If you'll recall, that line graph didn't have a title and it didn't have any labels. So in this slide, we've begun adding some of those elements. At the top of the graph, you can see that concise descriptive title. And then on the left and at the bottom, you can see the axis labels. Finally, you can also see the axis data units clearly specified and the data labels at the bottom of this graph. All of these elements are making this data visualization significantly more informative. Next, let's talk about how we can introduce color into our data visualizations to make them more visually appealing and make them more effective. And the best way to do this is to use the color wheel to enhance the contrast of your graphics. Some of you may remember the color wheel from elementary school art class. In that context, we were using the color wheel to understand how we could combine colors to create new ones, or what kinds of colors looked good together. But for the purposes of this class, and for data visualizations, we're going to use this to understand what kinds of colors contrast with one another. Because when we add color to data visualizations, we want to maximize contrast so that viewers can quickly and easily identify the colors associated with one data set or data series from another data set or data series. To use the color wheel effectively, simply choose colors that are across from one another on the wheel. Okay? So green and red have strong contrast because they're across from each other on the color wheel. Yellow and purple have strong contrast. Blue and orange have strong contrast. This is how you can use the color wheel in the context of creating effective data visualizations. Returning to our example, we can see how the use of contrasting colors derived by referencing the color wheel have not only enhanced the visual appeal of this data visualization, but also enhanced and maximized contrast between the colors associated with each data series. Finally, we want to make sure that the formatting of all of our graphics, all of our data visualizations, is consistent with the formatting of the larger document in which it's situated. Let's go back to our example one last time. Now you'll recall that in previous versions of this chart, not only did the chart use Calibri rather than Century Gothic as we've been using elsewhere in this PowerPoint, but also the font was in gray rather than in navy blue, which is the standard font color for this PowerPoint. So to make the document visually cohesive, I've changed not only the font, but the font color in this data visualization, which now brings it into line with the formatting of the document as a whole. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of today's audio lecture. As a reminder, well-designed documents invite your readers to engage with your writing. They're also easy to scan and to navigate quickly. Effective visuals, on the other hand, which includes graphics and data visualizations, are easy to analyze and to recall. They present data efficiently, and they translate well across cultures, which is essential in our increasingly globalized business environment. Thank you for listening.